welcome to the Zero Ends channel. Please like and subscribe. Please enjoy our live.
All right. Welcome again to another reading section. This is chapter 13, and this will probably be a full length reading, not many pages. And for those that have come to listen to this podcast or will go back to recording, thank you. Like I said before, this is a series, and like all series of a lengthy book that's roughly now over close to 80 years old, it's come close to the end, as y'all know. So most of y'all know that this has a lot of history to it, and for the sake of argument, y'all should know that the history that's been talked about, American Negroes, African Americans, or indigenous, whatever you want to call them, in this country, how a lot has been miseducated, which is all by design and intentional to keep you from really fulfilling your actual destiny and purpose, and that is to take control and rulership of your not only your lives but as a people entirely. Here in the West region, we call America, and we go say further abroad, but for the sake of conversation, this book only deals with America, since in regards to slave revolts, how your ancestors dealt with slavery, how they handle it, how they survive it. The one important thing about anything that you go back to or you research yourself, you have to always understand the who, what, when, where, why, purpose, why they did certain things, what outcome they were getting out of this. Did it benefit them? Did it serve them? These are things you should always ask when you look back into actual history. And as y'all know, history is not really a nice thing when it comes to world history. And at the end of the day, I'm hoping that this will be a tool like any outlets, because a lot of people, when they use any form of internet or any podcast or any outlet in regards spreading information, whether dispelling the myth or deconstruction, fact to fiction, truth to lie, you have to really take any information that you coming forth and try to look at more holistically and take it as the whole. And you got to understand why was it important that most people that go to regular formal school systems don't know the basics of history, because history is like a template to know where you at, where you potentially are going to be, and where you're going in the future. And nothing was left in the past that you don't see now in the present. Let me see what this is. Okay. All right. Well, I'm just checking the status, and I'm gonna have to improve on that. But nonetheless, let's get started. If anybody is right there live active, tell me where you at. You know what I'm saying? So I know that you're there, you're here, you're listening. You know, I'm not sure I'm gonna answer questions while going through this book, and it's not gonna be a long, lengthy podcast today. So listen good. If you want to leave questions, you can leave questions there, and I'll look frequently. So now, on to the reading. This is chapter 13, 1835 through 1849. The year is 1835. Witness the reopening of this never long interpreted drama of the organized struggle of an enslaved people to throw off their yoke. This particular act lasted until 1842, after which once more a monetary intermission occurred. The locale of the first scene was the lush new soil in the heart of Mississippi, Madison, and Hinds counties. To this region in the 30s came thousands of men on the make intent upon cashing in on the fluffy golds that might be produced and bringing more thousands of slaves turned from every state in the South and often from all person and association dear to them. The preoccupation of these slave drivers with the alchemy procuring wealth by selling the white product of black men told was rudely interpreted in June 1835 when rumors of an independent Negro insurrection began to fly around. In that month, a lady of Madison County reports to her neighbor that she had overheard the following alarm statements of one of her slaves. She wished to God it was all over and done with, that was she was tired of waiting on white folks and wanted to be. And there's a subtitle, and let's look what this is. Yeah, we can read it. James K. Polk wrote his wife on September 26, 1834, that he had decided to purchase land in Mississippi and ship his slaves there. The Negroes have no idea they are going to be sent to the South, and I do not wish them to know it, and therefore it would be best to say nothing about it at home, for it might be carried back to them. J. S. Bassett. The Southern Plantation Orchestra, this is page 78. The rate of increase of slaves in Hinds and Madison County was greater than that of other counties in the state from 1890, or actually 1830 to 1840. In the former years, slave formed 39.4% of the plantation. In the later years, this had jumped to 68.8%, and L. C. Gray, History of Agriculture to the Southern United States, the second. And that's page 903. In 1837, there was 3,675 whites and 11,238 Negroes in Madison County. D. Rowland, History of Mississippi, page 783. According to reports, the vigilantes committed the suppression of the plots of Negroes, outnumber the whites by 50 to 1 in the immediate areas, and the origins of Langston and Bastet Butler, H. Howard, and the history of V. Burgo Standards, appendix, page 233. And that's a little subtitle of that. Let's go on. Her own mistress, the balance of her days, and clean up her own house. A favorite slave was sent along the others as a spy, as soon accused one Negro. This man, after receiving a most severe chastisement, confession that a plot for revolt had been formed, and implicance of Mr. Reuel Blake, a local slaveholder, and his, by order of the vigilantes or vigilance committee, but refused to confess anything, alleging all of the times that they want to know what his master had told him. They might whip on until they kill him. That he had promised him that he would never divulge it. Other slaves were tortured, and it was finally determined to the committee satisfaction that their existence of generalizing plots of the slaves, and that a number of white men were implicating by the decisions of that extra legal body. About 15 slaves and 6 white men were hanged in the month of July. At least 2 of the later William Sanders and Joshua Content appeared to have been members of a gang and desperados and bandit led by John Merlin, one of whose specialties was the stealing and reselling of slaves. Other, however, Motley Rule Blake and A. L. Donovan, reports from Kentucky appear to have taken part in the plot because of the sincere wishes to aid and belittle or liberating the Negroes. There is evidence indicating that the vigilantes or vigilance committed or some members of it operate under the name of regulators and got out of hand and began directing their violence against wealthy people, particularly a Judge Patrick Sharkey, who barely escaped with his life. The governor was told that unless there is a stop put to the shedding of blood, confessions and revolution must shortly reign over the land. By the end of July, however, relatively orders was restored, or order was restored. Before the year was ended, acute alarms had been experienced in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas. In August, the town of Charleston, Maryland, was thrown into an uproar for several days because of suspicion of an impending uprising simultaneously by a white man. The community was guarded every night and by armed men of the first respectability. But just what foundations exist for the fear of uncertainty? That same month, a white man named Bradley was arrested near Charleston, South Carolina for alleged attempt to interest slaves in an uprising, while another named Robinson was hanged near Lynchburg, Virginia, for the same offense. Suspicions arose in September concerning the behaviors of slaves working in mines in Limpkin County, Georgia, while 3 whites were lynched in Atkins, South Carolina, and Jefferson County, Georgia, for sedition activities, and another was, for the same reason, driven out of Twigg County, Georgia. And there's a subtitle which I'm not going to go into. The high pitch of incitement in the slave area is revealed by an episode that occurred in September in Buckingham County, Virginia. A group of slaves marches along the road and carry across their shoulders what happened to the weaponing participation panic sent children and adults scampering and producing in hurl calls for the militants, and soon developed that the slaves were carrying nothing but tools and were marching nowhere but off to work in nearby mines. What appears to have been a bona fide conspiracy was uncovered in October of 1835 in Elizabeth County, North Carolina. Free Negroes were declared to be involved as well as slaves, and the contemporary press asserts the excitement was as great as had been in 1831. The slaves involved were banished, and the free Negroes were also forced to leave the states. An old domestic slave reveals that some months a plan of rebellion comprised slaves in Georgia and in South Carolina. Northern lumbermen were believed to be instigators of this movement. From press accounts, the Georgia County of Monroe and Jones appeared to have been the center of disaffection, and a considerable number of slaves were arrested. 2 of ringleaders were selected for punishment that meted out to one being death, while the other was whipped, Bradley and Cropped, or branded and Cropped. In December, a fairly serious effort at rebellion was nipped by the discourse of a confidential servant of a planter living in East Felician, Louisiana. Once again, whites this time too were believed to be implicated, as well as a great many of most favored confidential servants, which made it all the more disturbing. Arms were found in the possession of about 40 slaves. Great excitement prevailed in South or St. Franceville and East and West Sicilian armed patrols swept over the courtside, and some of the planters moved into New Orleans for great safety. The fate of the slaves involved is unknown. Negroes of Missouri were overhauled in the spring of 1836, communicating their design to other slaves, and by this means were detected before their schemes was ripped for execution. The plan was to murder their master, take whatever money they could find, and make for Canada, or in other words, run to Canada. Their punishment is laconically indicated in the line that destination was changed for the South. In June of this year, Maroon bands were especially active and dangerous in Gates County, North Carolina, and in the cypress swamps near New Orleans, or the cypress swamps. The next year, slave disaffection of an organized nature seems to have centered in Louisiana. In July of 1837 came reports of a killing of an outlaw slave leader, Squirrel, near New Orleans, whose band had been responsible for the death of several white men. Squirrel's career had lasted for years. A guard of soldiers was sent to be in the swamp for his body, which was exhibited for a few days in the public square of the city. A conspiracy said to have been better planned and managed than any known before was betrayed in October by a slave. Lewis belonged to a Mr. Compton and replied Parachute, Louisiana. The revolt was supposed to begin in Alexandria, but the rebellion had disagreed, and to whatever all the whites should be killed, or the women and children should be spared. This caused delay and the betrayal by Lewis subsequently an uprising before it could begin. About 50 or 60 slaves and at least 3 free Negroes were arrested. The free Negroes and at least 9 of slaves were hanged, while several others were sentenced to life imprisonment. 2 companies of United States troops were stationed in the disaffection regions and succeeded in restoring the order. And there's a subtitle here. Let me look for this. It's other more detail, but it's in small print, which you can read for yourself. The zone of greatest troubles moved to the border areas in 1838. In the District of Columbia, reports of a severe plot arose in May. Armed citizens and regular police patrols came out in force, arrested several slaves and a few white men, and broke up, according to the press, some infamous deeds in which the citizens or the schemes have been hatched. At Florence and Bone County, Kentucky, a conspiracy to rebel was undercover and its movements thwarted in November. 6 of the insurgent leaders, apparently aided by white men, managed to escape and safely made their way into Canada. The next month, a concerted plot entered into by a large number of Negroes of Williamson and Rutherford County, Tennessee, was discovered and suppressed. And some slaves' trouble of an unspecific nature was reported in February of 1839 from Littleville Parish, Louisiana. A vigilant patrol was instituted and tranquility finally prevailed. In the same month, several attempts at the distinction of Macon, Georgia, by fire was made, and residents wrote, and this is what they wrote: Suspicion falls mainly on the slaves. I can give you no accurate or satisfactory information as to the particular, and the alarm and dangers are too great to allow as to make investigations at present. No person feels a disposition to sleep again tonight. Pay or and not only the police but citizens generally, as well as sailors, are extremely vigilant and a great excited. A report of general conspiracy of the slaves of Memphis, Tennessee, swept through the city in March. A vigilant committee was appointed, and on March 17th, at a public meeting, it reports that the rumors were gross exaggerated and that only a few slaves had actually planned vengeance upon the whites by the use of poison. Their fate is not known. A similar rumor prevailed in Louisville, Kentucky in December, and about 40 Negroes were arrested. Military precautions were taken, but precisely why these concerns exist is not clear. The slaves were disturbing in widely disparate areas in 1840. Uneasiness began reporting from Washington, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, Alabama, and about all Louisiana. In June or July, panic prevails. The counties of Southampton and Westmoreland in Virginia. Military precautions were taken and some slaves were arrested, but apparently no conclusion or conclusive evidence of conspiracy was uncovered. In the summer, considerable alarms prevailed Craig County, North Carolina, on accounts of a supposed conspiracy of Negroes, and there were reports too from Petersburg, Virginia, of a similar nature, which led to the taking of special measures of control. Interesting. A few Negroes were arrested in August in Charles County, Maryland, upon suspicion of having been engaged in insurrectionary movements, one of whom confessed that a plot had been made up to commence an attack on Washington City on the night of the 30th of August, for the purpose of, as was alleged, of obtaining their rights. End quote. The Maryland of the city summoned civil and military authorities, and the streets were carefully patrolled. Rumors of serious impotence trouble circulating. One gentleman suggests to the president that the station, or that his station, is full company of U.S. troops at the arsenal for all and for calls of any instance, for it is notorious true that the public mind is seriously agitated with apprehension of Negro insurrections, and that it is becoming more and more so. We have reason to know that we in this distinct feel that apprehension and have cause to dread its consequence. The local press asserts that the dangers have been magnified and the arrests of a few whites, vigilantes, and some Negroes restored were quite. In September and October, large-scale conspiracies involving hundreds of Negroes were reported from 7 parishes in Louisiana: Avovilla, Rapins, Saint Laudrine, Lafayette, Interville, Vermilion, and Saint Martins. Many slaves and few whites were arrested, and scores were lashed, and considerable numbers were extinguished or lynched, and at least 2 of the Negro leaders committed suicide, and that was executed too. According to New Orleans, Paya, on September 1st, about 400 slaves in Emerville alone were induced to the rise against their masters, but they were easily put down. 40 were placed in confinement and 20 sentenced to be hung. 4 white abolitionist radicals were implicated in this region. 6 slaves were sentenced to death in Lafayette, but one, Eugene, the leader of cheated the gallows by drinking poison. In addition, another conspirator of that parish received 50 lashes, was sentenced to the stock for 2 years, and a wear iron for another or 2 years. The leader of the slaves of St. Martin also committed suicide. 2 whites were held to have aided the slaves in this parish and St. Laundry, but since Negro testimonies was not legal against them, they were lashed at the command of Lynch County in order to leave the states at the perils of their lives. The Rapides and Avoyas parish of Negroes had planned a mass flight with Mexico as a goal, but when all preparation had been made, the leader Lee Cheney, in order to curry favors with his master, betrayed the plot. The fugitives were surrounded, carried in chains in Alexandria and Rapides, and hung by the pulpits. Not only thus, by many who were suspect, though entirely innocent, were taken from the field and from the cabinets, and without the shadows of process of forms of trial hurled to the scaffold. Louis Cheney escaped and was even rewarded for his treachery. His name is dispensed and exaggerated by all his race throughout the parish of Rapides and Avoyelles. A careful conceived conspiracy was discovered among the slaves of Augusta, Georgia in February of 1841. Several Negroes were arrested, as was a young white teacher named Hans. Plan had been laid for the seizure of the arsenals of destruction of the city by fire. At least one of the rebels' leaders was executed, but nothing further is known concerning the fate of those involved. Reports organizing in New Orleans in July told of widespread plots in West Felician, Louisiana, and the neighbors of Woodville, Mississippi, and some slaves were jailed. They were, however, soon released, and there appears to have been little foundation for the slave. Somewhat later in New Orleans, newspaper editorialized on the fact that enmity between the whites and the blacks race is rapidly maturing, and pointed to the late repeat attacks of the Negroes upon the white man in our city. These, said the papers, and it quotes, shall excite our suspicion whether they be not the pickets guards of some stupendous conspiracy among the blacks to fall upon us unawareness. The writer urged, let us always be on guard and grant the indulgence to the Negroes, but keep him strictly within his sphere. Actions in line with the suggestion was shortly taken. The Maroon activity was preeminent during the years. This is January. Arms, runaway, repulse, and attacks near Wilmington, North Carolina after killing one of the whites. A possessed captured 3 of the Negroes and lodged them in the city jail. One escaped, but 2 were taken from the prison by about 25 whites and lynched. Late in September, 2 companies of militants were dispatched in search of a lady of slave outlaws some 45 miles north of Middle Alabama. It is believed that these fellows have for a long time been in that practice of thieves and arsons, both in town and county. A force from above was scorching down with bloodhounds and to meet the middle or the mobile party. A month later, frequent attacks upon white men by runaway Negroes was reported from Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana. A paragraph in a New Orleans newspaper published a year later indicating that this maroon problem was persistent, seriously, and had great possibilities, and declaring that the November 1842 some excitement prevailed in the parish of Corradine, Madison. That was subtitles, sorry. And Caroline, in consequence of the discovery of a contempt rising of the Negroes. There are now in the swamps of the region about 300 runaway Negroes belong to said parish, all armed and presumed some 50 or 20 Negroes have been arrested, examined, and from the fact excited and believed that the insurrection was contemporized about Christmas. The plot soon to have been extensive, embracing Negroes from nearly every plantation in the 3 parish. There were reports of an incomplete and identified nature of plotting among slaves in Marshall County, Tennessee, and in the northern section of Alabama early in the summer, of again in Fulton, Missouri in the fall of 1842. The remainder of the 40 were relatively quiet years, though occasionally report of mass unrest recurred. There were, for example, several notices of difficulties with the militant Negroes, outlaws, thus nearly Hansville, Mississippi, in February 1844. Some armed planters set and abolished for fugitives, outlaws who had been exceedingly troublesome. 6 Negroes, part of the gang, were trapped, but 3 managed to escape. 2 were wounded, and 1 was killed. In November of 1846, about a dozen armed slaveholders surprised a considerable gang of runaway Negroes in St. Laurent Parish, Louisiana, and the Maroons refused to surrender and fled. 2 Negroes, a man and a woman, were killed, and 2 Negroes women were badly wounded. The other escaped. Early in 1848, fugitive slaves living in the Desmo swamps between Virginia and North Carolina were similar attacked, and a few were captured. A fairly serious outbreak occurred in Maryland in July of 1845. An account in a paper of state declares that a group of slaves numbering about 75 men from St. Mary, Charles, and Prince George County set out in March orders for the free state of Pennsylvania. One of the slaves had a gun, another a pistol, and the rest carried scimitar blades, which are like, those long blades, shaped bent blades, if y'all know what a scimitar blade is. Swords and clubs. They went 6 abreast, heed by a powerful Negro following, sword in hand, intercepting parties from several directive set out in pursuit and caught up with surrounding and attacks and the rebels near Rockville and Montgomery County, about 20 miles north of Washington and by 50 miles from Pennsylvania. Several of the Negroes were shot, 31 were captured and lodged in Rockville jail. 5 of them were wounded, one seriously. A free Negro was found guilty of compliancy of the affairs and was sentenced to 40 years imprisonment. One slave, a leader named William Wheeler, was hanged, and most of the others were sold out in Maryland by their masters. In the summer of 1845, there were 2 attempts at rebellion among the slaves of Louisiana. One of the neighbors of Captain and others about 50 miles south of Sago. In each case, the slaves were armed by the superior equipment of the master class, led by the quick suppression of the outbreak. Conspirators outbreaks were reported in 1846 from Florida, Louisiana, Virginia, Tennessee, and the reports from Louisiana and Virginia were contradictory, and the early ones given detail pointing to grave trouble, but the later accounts tending to minimize the disturbance. It is certain only that some cause of alarm did exist near New Orleans in February and near Richmond in May of 1846. In the later part of the years, probably in December, a conspiracy to rebellion which got no further than the destruction of one house by fire was discovered in Memphis, Tennessee, and led to the arrest of several Negroes. An event occurred in Fayette County, Kentucky in August 1848, which was very similar to the break for freedom made by Maryland slaves 3 years before. On Sunday, August the 5th, about 75 slaves from the county, led by a young white man named Patrick Doyle, a student of Centre College in Danville, Kentucky, armed themselves with guns and crude weapons and boldly set forth for the Ohio River and Liberty. A reward of $5,000 was offered for the group captured, and well over 100 white men. One account said 300 set out to apprehend them. 2 pitched battles were fought, in which one Negro and one of the pursuing white men were killed, while another of later was wounded. Apparently, nearly all the rebellion, including Patrick Doyle, were finally captured. 3 of the Negroes' leaders, Shadrach, Harry, and Presley, were hanged, and Patrick Doyle was sentenced to severe or several 20 years in prison, or to serve 20 years in prison. In the month of these convictions, October, a plot among 40 slaves in Woodford County, Kentucky, to emulate the actions of Fayette Negroes was discovered and frustrated. About 300 slaves in the region of St. Mary, Georgia, which is close to the sea and at the Florida borders, had planned in July 1849 to rebel and seize a steamboat and the Williams Galston. With Dave and with this, they had intended to reach the British West Indies, but a delay of the boat arrived at St. Mary led to the plot exposure and suppression. There were also implications of trouble at about the same time in South Carolina. And there's a letter here from the same section. But that concludes chapter 13. And as y'all know, chapter 13, 1835 through 1849. And as y'all know, like the previous chapter, but in somewhat more little detail. A lot of more deaths, a lot of more frustration because of slavery, and a lot of more revolts took place throughout that 10 to 13-year span. And as y'all will notice, as this conclusion of this book, it's been evident and it's been clear so far to those who will listen to this that your ancestors were not just some run-of-the-mill people that took it in and waited for the Caucasoid or your master to free you. And mind you, in this chapter alone, there were white males helping to conspire to even create more uprisings, but they never did free the slaves. If y'all notice from what I've read so far. And the one thing now looking at this chapter, isn't it funny that it was these same Caucasoids sitting there creating some uprising to help some of these Negroes to create some type of revolt or some type of revolution in this country in a way where they're trying to start some type of race riot? I find it very funny. I'm not sure people caught that. And we know we live in the 21st century now. And if this happened 100 and I think almost 120 something years ago, or better yet, almost 20 years ago, 100 and 18 something. Yeah, almost. We look at almost 170 years, 70, 80 years. And we see now the times we live in now, what they did back then, just for their own agendas. Because if you look at it, they never was really intention to do this for the slave. They were doing this for a bigger scheme. Same with Jim Brown. Y'all know the story of Jim Brown. Who will not forget about him? Yeah, he took a part to help some of these slaves get guns and then fight against the Union and all that stuff. But once he got what he wanted, he said he had no use. And I think the same Europeans back then that enticed a couple of slaves that don't want to be slaves anymore has the same schemes now. Nothing's changed. And as you know, throughout the history, nor are they little part into helping some of the Negroes, descendant slaves here in America. Same game, same rules apply to them. They only need it or use it for when it's purposeful. But when they get what they want, they have no use for you. Especially the ones that help some of these slaves in this chapter. So don't be fooled. Do not be fooled. So I will end it here. I'm not sure if people either still here or have any comments or questions on this. I don't see nothing there. So I'd like to thank everybody for listening to today's reading. Be on the lookout for chapter 14. Thank you for listening. Until next time, take care.